because that's a nice segue to kind of my story and a good introduction to this session. Because I was in a similar situation, Kelly. I had been teaching for about 10 years when I went to law school, and my goal during those whole 10 years was not to go to law school, it was to go to medical school. In fact, I was teaching MCAT long before I ever heard of the LSAT. And it was from the perspective of a professional test prep instructor that I first learned about the LSAT and started thinking about taking it and studying it. And I became really intrigued. So I was approaching the LSAT from the same perspective you are, a career shift and just a lack of familiarity with the content of that exam, complete lack of familiarity with the content. And I found it to be such a tremendous challenge that it became sort of the formative like identity of my professional life and much of my personal life as well. The LSAT became a vehicle for intellectual development for me. I learned things that I had never known before, maybe things I should have studied, but didn't because of whatever immaturity I had as an undergrad. And so I had to grapple with holes in my own knowledge and how to fill those. And there was also a set of skills tested on the LSAT that had never really come to the fore in my science studies and in my previous endeavors to go to medical school. And so I found myself really struggling to improve on the LSAT. When I came from a position of strength, I thought as an MCAT instructor that I would easily score terrifically on the LSAT. And when my gains didn't come immediately, it started to occur to me that this test, there was a tremendous amount of depth to this test. There are skills and forms and concepts and philosophies that underlie the questions that are not apparent on the surface. And I think they're not adequately represented or treated in the prep materials. And so that started a career journey for me. I made it a goal to master the LSAT, and it took a couple years. That led to a lot of success in my admission cycle and a scholarship to a tier one school. And so I ended up going to law school and practicing law. But I never lost the passion for teaching, and so I returned to teaching at the university level. I taught at the law school level. Ultimately, though, I kept thinking that the LSAT was so formative, such a profound vehicle for learning, that that's what I wanted to focus on. And so here we are, and I'm doing LSAT prep and talking to some beginners 20 years into my test prep journey. But I'm glad that you guys have come. Ashton's here too. She's one of my students who I've worked with for some time. And so welcome, Ashton. Um, I'm going to start a presentation so that I can talk to you guys about the different resources that exist and how to navigate that market. It is an insane market. And there are a lot of ways to misstep. All right, let me figure out how to present this. Okay, so what I'm doing today is starting a new project. I've been doing my pro bono tutoring for many months now, but I haven't recorded any of them, mostly so I could fudge a little bit and use some copyrighted materials. Um, but I'm not going to do that anymore. I want to present kind of fresh, original stuff, and I want to record it, and I want to get some of these videos out there for YouTube or for my TikTok account. And so, what I'd like for you all to do is please feel free to stop me and ask questions at any time, because I think that that interaction will be more interesting for my listeners. And I wanted to get through the personal introductions first so that you don't have to share any personal details. But if you all have questions that you'd like to ask me, please stop me. And then if that portion of the video, if I end up cutting it and using it for a TikTok video and you give me your permission to do that, then I'll meet with you for an hour and we'll do some private tutoring, and I'll throw that incentive out there. So please feel free to stop me and ask questions at any time. And we've already got a question from Wendy. She has the PowerScore Bibles. She has the LSAT trainer, and she's wondering how to juggle what must be 1,000 pages of reading. And so we'll talk about that today. And speaking of 1,000 pages of reading, that's just two of the many resources. If you stacked up all of the different LSAT books that exist, you'd get to the moon and back, I imagine, because there's just an absolute proliferation of products, books, courses, and tutors. I call it a financial black hole. I mean, you could spend a fortune on LSAT prep. I know people who've spent a fortune on LSAT prep, and not all of them have earned the score gains that they were looking for. And so it really is a very tricky market. It's almost like other types of training that I'm familiar with, musical training or athletic training. Everybody has goals, but we all have limitations as well. And then there's also this dynamic of how well do you interact with the teacher or with a resource? How well does it resonate with your learning style? And so that creates a level of complex questions that is beyond comprehension. And it's why I enjoy teaching so much. If you think the LSAT is complicated, try studying LSAT students. Try figuring out how their minds work, because that is really, really a tricky puzzle to get them to think in a logical way and to motivate them to do the kind of repetition and drills necessary to be proficient at the LSAT. It's not an easy endeavor, and getting them um, to question their goals and their expectations and make sure that they're realistic. That's also a big part of my job. So let's start unpacking this world of LSAT materials. I'm going to go in order of cost, because if I'm right, if this is a financial black hole, then the right way to navigate it is to start with the least expensive materials and work your way up. One of the reasons why I feel kind of ambivalent about my role in the LSAT market is that I don't think my private tutoring is a good value for a beginning student. I think there are many, many tutors who can teach you how to diagram a logic game, how to find a conclusion of an argument, etc. But when I become very valuable is when a student has some advanced skills and other tutors can't get them from the 160 to the 170 hurdle. So you want to navigate this in terms of cost. You don't want to hire me first thing. That's the bottom line. But there is one resource that I think is just indispensable, and that's the LSAT Prep Plus account. It's the official license to use the prep test, the LSAC official material. And it is really a tremendous value. You get 70 plus official prep tests for $100 a year, and they give you the tests in the same digital interface that you'll use to take the official LSAT. So it seems like a total no-brainer to me. There's no resource that's more vast or more valuable than LSAT Prep Plus. I would not try to skip this by pirating the exams. That may have been possible in the past when it was a paper and pencil test. But now, even if you get the exams, you don't get the official interface. So I would just pay the $100, get LSAT Prep Plus. That will also unlock some doors for you to purchase some subscriptions that I'll talk about a little bit later in the presentation. I think when we do a cost benefit analysis of LSAT Prep Plus, when I say there are no costs, I don't mean that it doesn't cost any money. I mean, when we look at the drawbacks of buying it, I don't think there are any negatives. There's no reason I would give a student to say, you should not purchase LSAT Prep Plus. You can get a few free prep tests on LSAT Prep without paying the $100, but you'll exhaust those very quickly and need the subscription pretty soon. So if you don't have the LSAT Prep Plus subscription, save up $100 as quickly as you can and get it. The next thing that I think is essential and just overlooked by many, many students is a strong dictionary. And I would not use dictionary.com. Not because it's wrong. I don't find it to be wrong. I find it to be incomplete. It often is missing connotations um, or historical roots of words that help me get to the more complex meanings that the LSAT has in mind. So dictionary.com is fine for your everyday conversational English, but it's not a good resource, I don't think, for the LSAT. I would get a tab on your internet browser to Merriam-Webster. I think Ashton got an app on her phone to really embrace this advice. But I don't know how a student can really diligently prepare for the LSAT without a strong dictionary. I find that to be somewhat of a paradox. I use the dictionary multiple times per day in my preparations for my tutoring sessions. So if 20 years of experience and a law degree haven't given me the fluency in English to grapple with the LSAT without a dictionary, I don't know why students think that they why they should attempt to do so. So get a really good dictionary and use it regularly. Every day that you're studying the LSAT, use the dictionary to look up words you don't know, but also confirm words that you think you know. There's many times where I look up a word thinking I know the meaning, and then I learn that it has a connotation or some kind of subtext that I'm not aware of. In other words, I've been using it wrong all along and sort of false in my confidence that I know what the word means. So be very liberal in your willingness to look up words. I think that, in one sense, every single question on the LSAT could be answered with the information in the dictionary. Of course, that's a little bit trite. That's like saying every LSAT question could be answered with the PowerScore Bibles. It's a vast resource that you can't memorize or peruse all at once. But if you use it in a targeted way, and the same thing is true with the PowerScore Bibles, if you use them in a targeted way, they can be very powerful tools to help you unlock individual words or individual skills one at a time. I don't think they're good resources to read from cover to cover, however. And so that's a comparison that I'll make for you, Wendy. When you think about turning to the PowerScore Bibles, I wouldn't necessarily think about reading them in their entirety. I would think about using them more as an encyclopedic guide, but we'll come back to that. All right, so what's the cost of using the dictionary, the drawback in our cost benefit analysis? This one's kind of funny because what students would define as the drawback, I would define as actually a benefit, but I put it here to discuss it as both. It requires a lot more active engagement to learn by using the dictionary than it does to turn to the PowerScore Bibles and say, teach me the words that I need to know. What does necessary mean? What is a sufficient condition, etc.? But honestly, Merriam-Webster defines those terms just as well as PowerScore. And so the books are targeted for LSAT use, but you can make headway into understanding the English using an English dictionary. It's kind of funny to me how simple it can be sometimes. I think the same thing is true of the bar exam. I made an MBE product for a company called UWorld, and I lamented one day at work that I thought a really clever student could pass the bar exam with nothing more than a few thousand practice questions and Black's Law Dictionary. And if you just sat there with the practice questions and looked up the legal terms in the question or in the answer choices, and then used a little bit of rationalization based on which answer choices were correct and which ones were false, you could deduce enough of the legal rules to do pretty well on the multiple choice section. And so I think the same thing is true here. Start with basics, start with the least expensive resources first. Of course, if you own the Bibles already, then you can turn to those because they're more targeted toward LSAT use. But the fact that the dictionary requires this kind of active engagement, I described it as a benefit, not an actual cost. That's one of the things that the learning science tells us is beneficial to deep learning, as opposed to superficial learning. The level of activity, of engagement that the student has is correlated with the length of the memories, the depth of the learning that occurs. Reading a strategy book, watching a video, those things feel comfortable and helpful, but it's often it's often an illusion because you're not actually practicing the skills that you're reading about. So I would actually consider that cost to be a benefit of using the dictionary. But okay, let's get to some of the actual LSAT materials. There's Khan Academy. The main benefit of Khan Academy is that it's completely free. Doesn't cost you a penny. And they've partnered with LSAC, and so the materials that you find on Khan Academy are official LSAT questions, which is important. It's one of the reasons why I've advised you all to buy LSAT Prep Plus, because I don't want people prepping with fake contrived questions. I don't think that they represent the LSAT well. And I think with 70 plus official prep tests, there's little reason to use made up questions. So you want official materials. Khan Academy has them. The problem is they don't have very much of it. They've got a few prep tests, a few lessons, and what I hear from students is that they exhaust those materials pretty quickly. And you can create some false confidence if you keep repeating the same materials over and over. That's not a route, towards success. So once you've exhausted Khan Academy, once you notice that you're starting to see repetitions of questions or repetitions of lessons, then I think that's time to break away and turn to more powerful materials or more comprehensive materials. The real problems with Khan Academy, in addition to the limited scope, is that they're not working to maintain or update the materials. If they were growing their library, that would be a step in the right direction, particularly because the LSAT evolves slowly over time. And I think there are concepts that have creeped into the newest prep tests in the 80s, and a student needs to learn those before they take the official prep test. But there's no vehicles to learn them. Even some of the best resources have a long delay before they catch up with the trends of the exam, and that's why ultimately tutors are going to be the most effective resource that you can get. Of course, there's a cost barrier, which is why people don't hire tutors for the whole, for their whole prep. Okay, so there's Khan Academy. The next thing I want to talk about are free explanations that you can find online. I'm doing these in order of cost in case you haven't spent anything and are working on a budget. If you Google search Manhattan Prep LSAT explanations or PowerScore LSAT explanations, what you'll find are forums hosted by each of these companies. And these forums contain explanations for hundreds or thousands of LSAT questions. The explanations have been created by tutors that work for these companies, and students can get in and interact in the forum and ask additional questions. So there's a little bit of depth to the explanations, but they're all written. And for many students, that's sort of a drawback. What I've seen in the polls on Facebook is that students prefer to consume this kind of material in videos rather than written form. And I think that's very unfortunate because the LSAT is a written exam, and ultimately I think your proficiency is going to be tested in that format and your ability to learn will be tested in that format. And so I think you should be comfortable learning with written LSAT materials, but that's not the student's preference. They want video lessons. And so if you're looking for video explanations, you won't find them here. You're only going to find written explanations. The other drawback, I think, to these forums is that they've used different tutors to generate the explanations for different sections. And so I think the quality can vary a little bit. Some of them are very good, others are not so good. To be perfectly honest, though, I use these not often. I mean, I almost always know the rationale or the explanation with certainty after 20 years of tutoring, but there are occasional questions that I think are so challenging. And my rationalization for the correct answer is so flimsy or so unlike the rationalizations that I've used in the past that I just want some confirmation by some other strong readers that they sort of see it the same way that I do. So I'll frequently turn to those forums to kind of confirm what I think is the right interpretation or explanation for an LSAT question. The other source of explanations that I'll point you to is Velocity LSAT. If you prefer to consume videos, Velocity has them. I think the founder of Velocity LSAT is Dave Hall, and so he's recorded hundreds of these little 2-3 minute explanations for every single question. And it's the same deal as the forums. If there's a question that I find particularly challenging, I'd like to get Dave's take on it. So I don't watch every single one of his explanations. I watch them for some of the most challenging questions, and we may have time to get into that later in the session. Scheduling, we'll see how we do on time and how we do on questions. The drawback, I think, of the video, the Velocity LSAT explanations, is that these are sort of the shallowest of the bunch. It's a 2 or 3 minute deal with no discussion and also no explanations of the wrong answers. And there's where I find students frequently have questions. It's a common occurrence for a student to come to me and say, I get the right answer, but I still think this one could be right too. And so it's eliminating the wrong ones that becomes sort of the crux of a lot of issues that I address with students. And so you won't get that from the Velocity explanations either. And like any static resource, a book or an explanation, there's no personalization to it. And that's ultimately what's going to lead to the conclusion of this presentation, which is tutors can do it better always, because it's one-on-one and highly personal. Of course, the quality of the tutor will vary, but a very skilled tutor will always be better than a very good product or a very good book. Okay, there's another series of written explanations that I'm particularly fond of, LSAT Hacks. And the founder of LSAT Hacks, Graham, he has a really innovative way of thinking about the LSAT that resonates strongly with my way of thinking about it. It's very structured, and it's a kind of a global approach to the whole test rather than a granular approach to this kind of question or that kind of question. And so I really appreciate his free explanations, and he has a unique perspective that I like to get, again, on difficult questions. And you know, the one drawback that I would say to his explanations is that I like the framework that he uses, but I can't find an explanation of his framework, sort of a description of it, a recipe for how to employ it, how to take new questions and map them out using his organizational tool or using his framework. There's no explanation for it. So if you get what he's doing, if you see the way he's organizing and the framework that he uses, you can copy it. But if you don't quite get what he's doing, it's hard to replicate it. Maybe you need the tutoring with Graham to get the full explanation of the framework. And that runs $500 an hour. So as we'll get to, the tutors are, although the most effective resource, also the most costly resource. All right, the last free resource that I could think of for our discussion today was the good old study group. Even large groups like the LSAT Facebook, group, or small groups where you meet with some individuals. So again, the benefit is that they're free. And for small groups, they can be good for accountability. Not always, but some small groups can be good to make sure that you're maintaining a schedule and sort of keeping up your studies. You might be required to present or explain on certain days that the group meets. And also you can tap into the benefit of teaching. I think that one of the best ways to learn something is to rationalize it to the level where you can teach it. And then you acquire a much deeper understanding of it than you do when you are simply convincing yourself that you understand it. In other words, it's hard to convince someone else that you understand something than it is to convince yourself. So strive to convince someone else, and that can be accomplished well with study groups. I think the drawback to study groups is that you get this blind leading the blind phenomenon. There's no expertise among the group. There's no way to break the tie. When one person says, I think it's this, and another person says, no, I think it's that. Um, I mean, sometimes the right answer will break the tie, but sometimes that's not the issue. The issue is, how do we rationalize the right answer? How do we rationalize the wrong answer? And when there's no expert in the group, then it's hard to know what takeaway message to, what message to take away from the group meetings. And I think we're starting to get more into the personalized realm here, though. The benefit of groups is that there's some personalization. But I also say that it's limited because everyone is trying to get what he or she needs out of the group interaction. And there's rarely a spirit of contribution to the needs of others or to the group goals. And that's sort of paradoxical. Maybe not paradoxical, but it's the wrong conclusion to draw, because it turns out, as a teacher, I can tell you that I firmly believe that my mastery of the LSAT is derivative of teaching it, not just studying it. I learn the concepts more deeply when I'm going to face a class than I do when I just review a prep test on my own. And that's a strange phenomenon, because what are the stakes? When you're learning it on your own, the stakes are your professional future. When you're teaching in front of a class, the stakes are merely embarrassment for being sort of non-expert in your teaching subject area. But for some reason, the embarrassment is a much stronger motivator. And so being, teaching a subject, there's something intrinsically motivating about that that gets you to learn concepts in a deeper way than you do when you have this extrinsic goal, like I want to go to law school or I want a high LSAT score. That's one of the things I try to preach to my tutoring students, is that intrinsic motivators work better than extrinsic motivators. This was a shocking phenomenon to me when I started studying the psychology of learning as a teacher. I really believed that people were typically extrinsically motivated. They wanted a high grade, they wanted to become lawyers, they wanted, to attain some goal, and therefore they acquire the knowledge to get there. And what I found is that the studies are pretty clear, and that the learning outcomes are far better when people are intrinsically motivated, meaning motivated by curiosity about the material itself and not the goal of acquiring the information. And so, to as much as possible, to encourage that as a springboard and not a hurdle or a hoop. It's not something you have to learn just to get into law school. It's very much like the MCAT. It's testing the principles that can and will make you a successful attorney. Can you read well? Can you read quickly? Can you deconstruct an argument in an organized way and understand its strengths and weaknesses? Can you do so quickly, on the fly, in court sometimes? Can you organize things well, like your client's files? Or is your file cabinet going to be a mess because you can't put things in order? You can't keep filing deadlines in order. Sometimes people ask me, what is the point of a logic game? Have 50 clients and try to keep track of every single deadline, all the filings, all the discovery deadlines. It becomes an enormous logic game. Different deadlines for every different client, different thing that's due on a different day. So those skills are relevant, they're important. And if you think about the LSAT as a vehicle, a springboard toward your intellectual growth and development, and ultimately your success in law school, it becomes far more interesting, and your results are far better than if you view it as simply a measurement of your worth or your intelligence. We could question whether those things are true or not true, but many people view it that way. Or even if they reject those things, they view it as a measure that will be used to decide whether they go to law school or not. And surely that's true. But there's a whole, I call it my test prep pedagogy. There's a whole world of things you can learn in spite of the fact that they're going to use the test in a way that you might find objectionable. So embrace the process. I find the test to be truly fascinating, and it's one of the reasons I say that those 70 plus prep tests are a steal for $100. The knowledge of those tests alone is vast. I mean, that is it's a tomb of the disciplines that we consider to be central to a liberal arts education in the United States. It's about history, it's about entertainment, it's about sociology and psychology and philosophy and science and all of the things that you are supposed to not become experts in, but become somewhat proficient in when you got your liberal arts degree. And so now it's time to either prove that you gained those proficiencies, or if you didn't, which was my case in certain subject areas, fill the gaps. Learn a little something about history or sociology or economics or formal logic or philosophy or rhetoric or whatever topics the LSAT is indicating are important for lawyers to know. All right, let's move on. I feel like I'm droning on and on. Oh no, one more free thing. My pro bono sessions. They're free. They will be often repetitive for you guys. You don't want to come to the beginner session too many times. You want to switch over, come, 2 or 3 times to the beginner session. I'll rotate the topics a little bit, but after a month or so, start coming to the vet session if you want to continue consuming my pro bono sessions. Other tutors do these as well. Jacob Feldman does office hours. Typically, the only tutors who have the luxury to do free stuff are highly experienced tutors. If you're doing a low volume of work and you're just starting out, it's just not practical to give it away. You can charge a low amount for it, but if you find the truly free pro bono sessions, you'll find that those are mostly highly experienced tutors. But I say that the quality here, one of the costs is that the quality is unpredictable. They're not all experienced tutors. Some of them are trying to market using their free sessions. Maybe all of us are. I don't know. I like to think that I'm a little bit, what is it? Philanthropic. I like to think that I'm a little generous and I'm willing to just give away the knowledge. But to some extent, I'm motivated by my desire to market my business. So the pro bono sessions are free, yada yada. Limited personalization. Okay. Here's the thing that I wanted to share with you guys. What Jake and I have in mind for the near future is to do kind of a subscription model, very low cost, where you guys can come to pro bono sessions where we are allowed to share copyrighted material. The biggest hurdle for me as a tutor in providing free materials to the public is that LSAC will sue me quickly if I'm sharing official questions. So that requires me to go make up my own questions. And I just told you 10 minutes ago, don't mess around with resources with made up questions because there's 70 plus official prep tests, literally thousands of official questions. Why in the world would you want any non-official questions? But then, the whole thing becomes this huge circle of logic. Then how do you share the official questions with your tutor if there's a copyright and if they are coming down hard on tutors who disseminate the questions or share them publicly? LSAC did something kind of brilliant, I think. I've been critical of them in many, many ways, but they've come up with this new pricing model where if you own LSAT Prep Plus, you've paid your $100, then and you start working with a tutor or a company like Seven Sage or some others that I'll talk about in a minute. The tutor or the company can get permission to share unlimited amount of copyrighted information with you for just a $30 fee. It's really reasonable. You pay the $100 to license the 70 plus tests, and their position is you now own the license, and the tutor pays a $30 fee just to work with you. Blah, blah, blah. So if we can get enough people to subscribe, $30 a month maybe, we could do sessions and share official questions and do a much more targeted way to deliver free, I say free resources. It's not free at that point, right? I mean, there's a cost. But we have in mind a low cost model for group tutoring that we'll be employing in the future, similar to my pro bono sessions, except I'll be able to share, official questions on screen and kind of show you guys, here's how I mark them up, here's how I diagram it, etc. Right now, the tutors who are doing that sort of thing, offering large group sessions, most of them are violating the copyright, and you can get away with that for a little while. But if you really want to grow as a business, I think it's better to work with LSAC and not steal their materials. Although some people who have violated their copyright have been very successful. Seven Sage started off with these free logic games lessons, and LSAC threatened to sue them. They had to take them down. And LSAT Wizard had a similar story. They had a very robust logic games product. LSAC threatened to sue them, and they had to put it behind a paywall and start charging students the $30 fee that I'm describing. So I have my choice. I can violate the copyright law until they get nasty, and then try to play nice with them. Well, we did it the other way. Jake and I, we bought the license, and now we're in a position where we can start enrolling students in our system for the $30 fee. So stay tuned for that. We'll have more pro bono sessions. They may not be pro bono in the sense that we may have to forward the costs, recoup the costs for that we have from LSAC, but we're working on that. In the next month or so, we'll roll something out, Jake and I. Okay, so loophole. I'm gonna start by going from least expensive to most expensive. How are we doing on time? Someone give me the time? You listening, Ashton? Anyone listening? What is it?
12:45
12:45. Holy cow.
Texas time. 12.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Gotcha. All right. So I got 15 minutes to wrap it up. All right. Loophole. Ellen Cassidy wrote a terrific book called The Loophole in LSAT Logical Reasoning. And it's so inexpensive. I don't know why anyone wouldn't read it. I checked today, it was $32 on Amazon. And what she's teaching in the first 8 chapters of this book is a logical fallacy called the false equivalence. This became the bread and butter for LR sections for many, many prep tests before she wrote the book. I think most tutors who were any good were teaching students how to deal with this. They just didn't give it a clever name, the loophole. And man, names, vocabulary, words mean everything. Ellen wrote a good book and gave it a clever name. And now the whole thing's associated with her. But what she's describing is the false equivalence. And that is a rhetorical fallacy that you absolutely need to be able to know, recognize, and describe. So read her book, particularly the first 8 chapters. However, this is a non-comprehensive technique. And what I mean by that is that not every flaw on the LR section is a false equivalence. It works for some flawed arguments, but not for others. And I think because it's non-comprehensive, Ellen felt compelled to add chapters, other techniques to the mix that might or might not work for those other question types. And I would describe the techniques later in the book as gimmicky. They're test techniques. They're not formative. They're not about logic and the skills that the test is trying to examine. And so, if you are going to consume her book, I might suggest reading the first 8 chapters and skipping the rest. It's still worth the money. The other drawback of Ellen's book is that the LR sections are moving away from the false equivalence flaw. It's still there. It's still important. I still teach it, but there are other types of logic that they're testing instead. And I think that a lot of that has to do with the success of her book. She kind of blew the lid off that particular technique. And so now, they have to look elsewhere to trick people. For example, statistical logic or causal reasoning seem to be more prominent in the later prep tests. And that was one of my criticisms of these books before. They're not responsive to those changes. This is the loophole in LSAT logical reasoning, not the loophole in prep tests, 80 to 89, which I think are the most reflective of the modern exam. But okay, the next set of books that I want to talk about are the Manhattan Prep LSAT strategy guides. These books do not get a lot of attention in the groups, and they aren't heavily advertised or marketed. It's about $200 for the set of 3 books, and I think that may be why they don't get as a great reputation. That's pricey. You could have the 3 Power Score Bibles for that amount of money. But I'm a big fan of Manhattan Prep. They're a very reputable company, and I think that their materials strike a really good balance between simplicity and thoroughness. If it's too simple, it's not comprehensive. You heard me talk about this a little bit so far, so like Ellen's method is not comprehensive. The loophole method, that's how you know it's not too simple. It works perfectly for the questions it was designed to work for. Manhattan Prep, I think, has a similar level of generality. It's simple enough so that a beginner can read it and understand it, but complex enough so that it actually does help you engage with and grapple with the material. Somewhat expensive though, and like all materials, no personalization. And I would say that that set of books is largely analogous to the Power Score Bible Trilogy, which Wendy was asking me about. She says she has the Power Score Bibles. Now, the Power Score Bibles I am really ambivalent about because, on one hand, it is the industry standard. It's the most comprehensive set of books. There's probably no LSAT question that can't be explained by some principle in one of those 3 books. But the strength of that set of books is also the drawback of that set of books. How many people can read and digest an expert strategy in the span of 1,000 pages of book material and then remember it and execute it on a practice test on a timed stressful environment? I find it difficult to believe that that's how you could do it. To me, that's like learning how to improvise on the saxophone by reading a book about it. Can you get better at improvising from information in books? Sure. But I don't think you can learn from the ground up. There has to be a certain level of practicing your skill set and then going back to the guide to see which skills need to be worked and in what order. So I find it very difficult to digest and implement the Power Score Bibles. When I read the Bibles, I had already been teaching test prep for 10 years. And when I finished the series of books, I remember thinking, wow, that's great if you want to be a tutor. But if you're just trying to get a high score, I don't know, maybe a bit overkill. All right, there's a question here, so I want to jump to it because I promised to maybe do prizes for answering questions. So Kelly asks, some study resources suggest using paper versus the electronic practice test. Why? Would you be able to go over the pros and cons of using the electronic versus paper and vice versa? I don't know why you would use paper at this point. I mean, if you want me to talk about the pros of paper in general, that's something that Jacob likes to rail about, Jacob Feldman, because he thinks that we learn better with a more tactile learning, platform. But the LSAT is not a paper and pencil test, and it's not going to be even when the pandemic is over. They had already made the transition to the digital exam. So at this point, I would say get good at digital reading. Other question by Kelly. What are realistic timeframes for studying to achieve scores in the 165 to 170? Seen in different forms, it takes a year. Others say it's relative to your diagnostic. I think that most people are going to need about 6 months before they reach sort of their initial plateau. Maybe initial plateau is the wrong word, a strong plateau. After 6 months, wherever you land after that 6 months, the gains are, you're going to fight tooth and nail for them after that. That's what I find. The gains come kind of rapidly at first. You familiarize yourself with things that you just didn't know existed before. And so that, you start just incrementally gaining. But when you hit that long plateau after 3 to 6 months, it's like exercising. It results in tremendous gains initially. So you're right, Kelly, that it is relative to your starting score. But that's not all the information you need. Some people will improve 5 or 10 points over the next 3 to 6 months. Some people will improve 15 to 20 points over those 6 months. I studied for 2 years, just to give you a little background on where did I start? It's difficult to tell because I was a teacher at Princeton Review, and I had no real incentive to like take a full length practice test. I had a good reputation as an MCAT verbal reasoning teacher. They were going to let me train to teach MCAT, and I was going to learn the test one way or another. I would estimate my original diagnostic scores were probably in the range of 160. And my final score 2 years later was 174. So 14-point increase. Couple 180s on practice tests, but that's not official. So for official, about, I would say, 14-point improvement. 2 years is a long time, though. It was very formative for me. From coming from a science background, there were things about logic and rhetoric and argumentation that I just didn't know. I never did debate. And even after scoring a 174 on the LSAT, I went to law school and there were still some gaps in my knowledge of argumentation. One day, my con law professor was talking about a case, and he said that it was the argument that was made in the opinion was missing a major premise. It was a weak argument. And I had to raise my hand. I said, "What are you talking about? A major premise? What is that?" And he was sort of shocked. He was like, "That's the whole form of rhetoric. Did you never do high school debate?" This is my con law professor in law school, sort of shocked that I didn't know a basic point of argumentation. So I had to go back and learn it. And that was really instructive to me because it helped me to see that you could get a really high LSAT score and still not know what the hell you're doing. And I went back to work and decided I was going to build some platforms that were truer to the skills that the LSAT's testing and were not so gimmicky. And I feel like I grew up in a framework of gimmicks at the company I was working for. All right. Also, should you start taking practice tests immediately before learning concepts or the other way around? Some resources believe that you should take practice tests timed, often, and immediately and learn concepts as you go. Some say learn concepts first, then take the practice test untimed to make sure you can answer the questions, then work on speed. What do I suggest? I have a whole presentation on this that I'm not going to get to today. I'll do it next Tuesday in my beginner session. I teach a strategy called triple review. It entails timed tests and untimed practice the whole way from beginning to end. And I think it resolves the tension that you're describing. What you're saying is, should I do timed tests or should I do untimed practice? And my answer is that's a false dichotomy. You should do both. And if you're going to do both, there's only one disciplined way to do it. You have to do the time test first. You can't time yourself after you've looked at the questions untimed. That's silly. So you do the time test first. You don't look up the answers. Then you do a very thorough blind review, completely untimed. And then we've got a strategy planning step as well that I'll teach you about next week. So please come next week and I'll flesh out that question a little more. Alondra asks, So there are 3 sections to study for the logic games, logical reasoning, and reading comprehension. How should I study for these 3? A combination of all or focus on one at a time? That's a good question. If you're going subject by subject, a course or a set of books, you could probably study with logic games, then do LR, and then do reading comp last. If you use my triple review approach and you're doing triple review section by section, you're going to end up getting a healthy dose of all 3 sections right from the get-go. So it's really a matter of perspective and framework. I mean, I'm totally biased. I developed a study system after teaching for 20 years and reading and thinking about the psychology of learning. And so if you ask me what I think is the best way to study the LSAT, my answer is always going to be triple review, supplemented with whatever books and tutors and resources you have. But triple review should be, I think, the forefront, like the defining feature of your study. It's what I have found to work for more people. I've done it both ways. I've taught classroom courses that went topic by topic. It works for some people and not for others. And I've done triple review with many, many tutoring students, and it works for most and fails for a few. So I'll take what works for more people, just what's more practical to me to try to go with the resolution that's going to work for more people first. Some people like the books though. Some people can learn with books and limited amount of interaction with the tutor or limited practice tests. But usually I think doing both is the right strategy. All right, so we've talked about the PowerScore Bibles. Wait, I had a thing here for, did I take it out? Oh, I had one for the LSAT trainer, and I must have deleted the slide, so that's definitely not going to make it to the TikTok video. Let me do one more topic, and then I'll end for the day. I'm sure I'm either over time or running short. But I want to talk about the LSAT trainer because Wendy said she owns it, and she wants to use that in combination with the PowerScore Bibles. The LSAT trainer is a different kind of monster. It's not like the PowerScore Bibles or it's not like the PowerScore Bibles or the Manhattan Prep books. And let me explain in a second. Alondra's asking how to get in touch with me. You can reach out to my personal account on Facebook if you like. If you don't know how to get my personal account, there's in the chat a link to the business page that I have that I work under. So, okay, let me talk a little bit about the LSAT trainer, and then I'll fix my slides later and try again a couple of weeks from now. So the trainer is unlike the other resources in that it's one book that covers all 3 sections rather than 3 different books. Most of the books that try to cover the whole LSAT, the comprehensive books, I think are I don't want to be too harsh. I was going to say pure garbage, but that's not the way I want to put it. They're not as good as the competitive books. I'd rather have the PowerScore Bibles than the Princeton Review book or the Kaplan book. But the LSAT trainer is a very powerful middle ground between the lengthy and dense individual strategy guides for each section and the kind of simplistic, gimmicky books that I've warned you against. The LSAT trainer does a really good job of showing you that paraphrasing is one of the skills that's sort of the thread between all 3 sections of the exam. How do you really interpret a logic game? You paraphrase it. You take the information that they give you and you repackage it in a way, sometimes symbolic, in a way that makes sense to you. How do you make sense of an argument? You find the conclusion, you organize it, you repackage it in a way that makes sense to you. That's paraphrasing. How do you work a reading comp passage? It often involves finding main points and focusing on them, prioritizing certain information over other information, that's paraphrasing. So the essence of the entire LSAT can be distilled down to how good are you at paraphrasing complex English statements. If you're really good at it, you'll be really good at the LSAT. And so the trainer is good because I think it starts to hint at the right skill. It's not just question by question, question type by question type, but there's a common thread through a lot of the advice in the LSAT trainer, which is learn how to paraphrase or recognize paraphrases. So back to Wendy's dilemma. She has the PowerScore Rivals and she has the trainer. I would, without a doubt, start with the LSAT trainer. That's going to be the resource that you can penetrate the most easily. And it's the resource that will give you the most bang for your buck. I mean, it will give you a perspective on all three sections that is sound. Nobody can say Mike Kim doesn't know what he's talking about. Mike Kim, I think he scored a 178 and went to Harvard Law. So, like, Mike Kim knows what he's talking about. I find that to be a good starting point. So work your way through the trainer. I wouldn't start reading the PowerScore Bibles though. If I had a nickel for every client, I probably do. I charged them all. If I had my hourly rate for every client who read the PowerScore Bibles and didn't make the gains that he or she wanted and then had to come hire me anyway, I'd be not that wealthy actually. But at any rate, a lot of people hire me because the Bibles don't work for them. And it's not that the Bibles are bad or that they don't work, it's that you often need something more. And so what I would do is begin, once you've consumed the trainer, then I would begin using triple review. I like to start with older tests, say prep tests in the 60s. Sometimes I start in the 70s, depending on the student's starting score. And then I work my way toward the newer exams so that I become familiar with the prep tests in the 80s in the weeks leading up to the official exam that I'm going to take. And I don't often know when a student should take the official exam. Like practice till you're getting the scores you need. Do the ones in the 60s. If you're hitting good scores on those, move to the 70s. Once you're scoring consistently well in the ones in the 70s, move to the 80s. So we're talking about, a process that's going to take a period of months. And it takes me at least a week to go through one prep test using triple review. So I'll give you a little bit of hints about the time frames involved, and then I'll end for today, and we can reconvene next week. I do a time test that's 35 minutes. My blind review step, going back and reviewing that section without looking up the correct answers, that takes me 2 hours or more. And that's from the perspective of an expert. So I don't stop and just say, well, I know the right answer, I'm done. I unpack the logic of those arguments deeply. I often rewrite them to try to think about how would we construct an argument that was good instead of looking at all these bad arguments. I spend my blind review time thinking about good arguments. What would it look like if the argument had been valid, if they had given me enough information to draw the conclusion? I look at the answers in a much more deeply way in blind review. I make sure that I have concrete reasons to eliminate every choice and choose every answer that I like. It's a really exhaustive, laborious process, blind review. And then, so it takes me 2 or more hours to blind review. We're talking about one section here, by the way. And then I do strategy planning where I try to unpack my mistakes and I try to come up with an action plan to fix the mistakes that I made on the previous time test. That takes me an hour, sometimes more, depending on how many questions I've missed. So we're talking about, 5 hours of work. It's not something I can do in one sitting or even two or even three sometimes. I have to break that up over a period of days. So it takes me often a week to complete a prep test using the triple review study strategy. But by the time I complete it, I've learned a lot about the mistakes that I make And I've done a lot of thinking about how I'm going to correct those mistakes. I'm not just, flailing around blindly. And the stage when I would employ the PowerScore Bibles, this is a nice ending point for me, Wendy. You didn't waste your money on those. You're not going to figure everything out on blind review. Even with unlimited time, you will miss questions. I do. And some of those questions are so challenging that you're going to be kind of baffled when you look at the correct answer and just be like, how? That's when you need to start reaching for explanations that I talked about before or the PowerScore Bible. When you have a particular question and you're just shaking your head thinking, I don't see how C could possibly be right, go watch Dave Hall's explanation. Get the grounding for how it could possibly be right. And if this happens consistently, 3 or 4 or 5 times in a row, you're asking that same baffled question about strength in questions. Now you know which chapter of the PowerScore Bible to read. If you're blown away by a group game, but you can do the order games, don't read the order game chapter. Who cares? You can do them. Go to the group game chapter because that's the one where you met your intellectual match. That's the chapter of the book where you're going to be engaged and not just reading to read, but you have a puzzle. You have this game that you just did and you couldn't figure it out. And now you have a reason to be in the chapter about group games and, extracting information and how does it pertain to that game, etc. So using triple review is not a replacement for the study guides. It's a way to organize your study schedule and a way to get the most out of those study guides. And I designed it because I felt really bad about students spending a fortune on my tutoring. I wanted to give them a way to study on their own, number one, but then when they do hire me for tutoring, to come more prepared with better questions. And so once they've done triple review, the questions that they ask me are so much deeper. It's not just I missed 13 and I don't get it. It's like, but C says most, and the original argument says most. How could that possibly not be right? They have much deeper justifications for the answers they've chosen, much deeper appreciation for the importance of the distinctions that I make in the tutoring session. So that was the impetus for triple review. I wanted to save my students money and ultimately um, I was afraid I'd talk myself out of a job. I had to kind of rethink my whole model. I can't do private tutoring forever if I'm teaching people a model to replace their tutor, or at least, to be a substitute for most of the work they would do with a tutor. When people come to me, I want it to be because they got stuck during step 3. They've done a whole lot of deep intellectual work. They've already read the PowerScore Bible chapter. They've looked at all the explanations and they just can't figure out what to do about it, how to improve their strategy, how to stop missing that kind of question. And there's where the top level tutors can be really helpful because you won't get that out of a book. They'll be able to help you kind of prioritize. These are the strategies that are going to help you over the hump. The other ones, don't worry about those because you're doing those things naturally and intuitively. Okay, I'm sure I'm over time, so I'm going to end for the day. I really appreciate you guys coming. I'm gonna watch that video and see if I can salvage anything. It was my first attempt, so probably not. But if you come next week, I will discuss the remainder of the resources didn't discuss today, and I also really want to talk about creating study schedules because if I had to say there was one thing that frustrates me with my students, even the hardworking ones, it's when they start and stop, and there's no continuity. There's no progress because we're constantly recovering things that we've covered in previous sessions. So yeah, what I'm gonna do, Alondra, in the past, what I did was I scheduled my pro bono sessions with like my leftover hours, whatever my students didn't book for the week. But then it made it unpredictable and hard for people to attend. So I would get, low attendance. So what I'm gonna do is keep my pro bono schedule exactly the same every week. It'll be noon on Tuesday. Sorry, I'm doing my local time. 1 o'clock on Tuesdays, 1 o'clock Eastern on Wednesdays, 8 o'clock Eastern on Thursdays. And the schedule every week is going to be lesson for newbies on Tuesday, lessons for advanced students or veteran students on Wednesday, and then non-traditional students on Thursday. We'll talk about part-time programs, extended study schedules, children and jobs and work and that kind of stuff. All right, thanks everyone for attending. If you want to chat with me, reach out to me privately. I do free consultations, and Jake and I frequently teach classes, and we're hoping to get that subscription model set up soon. And so we may be able to offer you some deeper pro bono sessions in the future. Pro bono is the wrong word. Some deeper low cost sessions in the future. Okay, thank you everybody.